The labor theory of value is, well, cringe. There is no other way to say it. It is an outdated, heavily flawed, and discredited economic theory that no reputable economist today vindicates. Despite the desperate crying by modern-day Marxists, there's simply no justification behind it, either logical or empirical. But to understand why it's wrong, we need to look at what it is. So, history time. Adam Smith was the foundation of modern-day economics, developing several economic concepts that we still use today for trade, business, and money. His magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations, single-handedly ended the entire economic system of mercantilism. However, in addition to coming up with the early concept of supply and demand, referred to as the invisible hand, specialization, and absolute advantage, he also came up with the first iteration of the labor theory of value. His theory was as follows. The value of a commodity is derived from the socially necessary labor time that went into it. Now, unlike Marx and Engels, who would later use this theory to try to fallaciously prove exploitation and the falling rate of profit and such, Smith never went to such conclusions. In fact, Smith only used this theory as value, as an abstraction of value, to explain his other theories. For example, when discussing absolute advantage, Smith states that countries should produce goods that require the least amount of labor time to produce, and get other goods from other countries at cheaper prices instead of making them themselves, as a way to increase value. Now, Smith and Ricardo acknowledge that this theory of value is heavily flawed. It's partly why they didn't use this theory to try to prove other economic principles and only used it as an abstraction. For example, Ricardo wrote to a letter to Smith saying that their theory of value does little to explain why wine becomes more valuable the older it becomes. Now, despite this, Marx and Engels heavily built on top of this heavily fallacious theory. And I must reiterate, they built on top of it, like a construction crew building a house on top of a faulty foundation. Now, despite Smith's incredible revelations of the modern economy, his writings are not required reading at any economics course. Most economists don't know the intricate revelations he made about tax policy and such. We aren't parsing over The Wealth of Nations 300 years later, looking for some pieces of hidden knowledge. We simply moved on. We understand the contributions he made, but he made many, many mistakes. And we acknowledge that. Marxists simply have not. But let's look at the labor theory of value.
There are three types of value in Marx's theory: use value, exchange value, and market value. These are all distinctly different, but all related. The last two are most important, as they are actual quantitative values, while use value is slightly more abstract. For Marx, something has use value if it's useful to society in some way, and that's it. He isn't concerned with what society considers to be useful, or why they do, just that they do. Every commodity produced under capitalism has, to some degree or another, a use value, because otherwise it wouldn't be produced. However, this use value does not determine the price of the commodity produced. The commodity also has an exchange value, defined as the ratio with which this one commodity exchanges with all other commodities. For instance, 10 cars to 1 house, 3 books to 5 grains of rice. Market value then, otherwise known as price, is this ratio expressed in the form of money, after fluctuations in supply and demand are factored in, which we'll delve into later. It's obviously a lot easier to just know the price of something, rather than the ratios for every commodity that you're interested in. So it's the exchange value that gets translated into a market price, rather than any kind of use value.
The problem here is that Marx couldn't make the simple connection that the price of a good, or the exchange value, is simply a manifestation of that good's subjective value, or the use value to society. Let's give an example. Say I bake 10 blueberry pies, with each of them taking 1 hour of labor time to produce. I then sell these pies in my town at $10 each. Now let's look closely at this transaction. Every single person who buys my pies is doing so because they value my pies more than they value their $10, which is why I don't why I don't sell them at a higher price. And the only reason I sell my pies at $10 is because I value their money more than my pies, which is why I don't sell them at a lower price. It's very simple. The reason why my pies have this exchange value, or price, has nothing to do with the labor time in it, but it's because they have that use value to the buyers. Now let's say I take my pies and bring them over to the next town over. Every single person in that town is, say, allergic to blueberries. They'll only buy the pies at 50 cents each because maybe they use as feed or fertilizer, or maybe they won't even buy them at all. The exchange value for this good is far, far lower than in the other town over. In other words, the exchange value of goods changes depending on the society it is sold in, as the use value changes depending on the society it is in. In other words, the exchange value is the use value.
What determines exchange value then? The labor time that goes into producing the commodity. This point is often one that receives the most scrutiny from Marxist critics, so perhaps it's worth setting aside some time to justify labor being the source of exchange values in society. There are two lines of reasoning Marx uses here. Firstly, take any two commodities, say gold and wheat. Their exchange values are expressible in ratios of each other, so maybe 3 bales of wheat to 5 bars of gold. And this is really expensive wheat, but bear with me. What we're then asserting from this, perhaps without even realizing it, is that these two quantities, in order to be equal to one another, must then be equal to some third thing independent of both. The area enclosed by a rectangle can be expressed in a certain number of right-angle triangles. But this is meaningless without first knowing how you attain the area of a right-angle triangle, half the width times the height. So, returning to the commodities, it then logically follows that the value of each individual commodity, if they can be expressed as ratios of one another, must therefore be equal to some third value. Why this third value is labor time, Marx explains as clearly as possible. As the exchangeable values of commodities are only social functions of those things and have nothing at all to do with the natural qualities, we must first ask, what is the common social substance of all commodities? It is labor.
What do I mean by this? Well, Ronald Reagan once famously said, "How do you tell a communist?" Well, it's someone who reads Marx. How do you read an anti-communist? Well, it's someone who understands Marx. As an example, the author of the 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah Jones is one of the leading pieces of literature on critical race theory and systemic racism. In it, she argued that all of America's institutions were founded on the idea or the notion to uphold slavery. The Revolutionary War, the Constitution, the economy, capitalism, the law, the police, and even Christianity, or at least American Christianity. The article was published by the New York Times and was almost immediately attacked by dozens upon dozens of actual American historians on the matter. Here's what historian Victoria Breum, James McPherson, James Oakes, Sean Willits, and Gordon S. Wood wrote in response to the 1619 Project. Quote, "These errors, which concern major events, cannot be described as interpretation or framing. They are matters of verifiable fact, which were the foundation of both honest scholarship and honest journalism. They suggest a displacement of historical understanding by ideology, dismissal of objections on racial grounds. Their objections of only quote-unquote white historians has affirmed that displacement. The New York Times asserts that the founders declared the colonies' independence of Britain in order to ensure slavery would continue. This is not true. If supportable, the allegations would be astounding. Yet every statement offered to validate it is false. Still, other material is misleading. The project criticizes Abraham Lincoln's views on racial equality, but ignores his conviction that the Declaration of Independence proclaimed universal equality for blacks as well as whites, a view he held against powerful white supremacists who opposed him. The project also ignores Lincoln's agreement with Frederick Douglass that the Constitution was, in Douglass's words, a glorious liberty document. Instead, the project asserts that the United States was founded on racial slavery, an argument rejected by a majority of abolitionists and proclaimed by champions. The process remains opaque. The names of only some of the historians involved have been released, and the extent of their involvement or consultants and fact-checkers remains vague. the selective transparencies are concerned. Furthermore, here's a letter of 12 other prestigious American historians wrote in a letter regards to the contents of the 1619 Project. Quote, "We do not believe that the authors of the 1619 Project have considered the larger context of their arguments with sufficient seriousness, or in a candid view of the assertions made by larger community of historians. We are also troubled that these materials have now become the basis of school curriculums with the impromptu of the..."
That's not to say all labour, however. Not all labour produces exchange value. Only labour that produces use value, otherwise known as social labour. The exchange value of a commodity for this society is determined by the average time it takes society to produce the commodity. As such, if you personally take 15 minutes to produce a commodity, but that society can produce it in 10 minutes on average, the commodity you've produced does not count as having any additional value and still sells in the market based on the exchange value attained by the average labour time. This average labour time to produce a commodity is referred to as the socially necessary labour time.
We do not believe that the authors of the 1619 Project have considered the larger context of their arguments with sufficient seriousness, or invited a candid review of its assertions by the larger community of historians. We are also troubled that these materials are now to become the basis of school curriculums with the prompter of the New York Times. The remedy for past historical oversights is not their replacement by modern oversights. We therefore respectfully ask that the New York Times withhold any steps to publish and distribute the 1619 Project until these concerns can be addressed in a thorough and open fashion. Now, I won't go into too much detail how these historians are arguments, as Three Arrows doesn't use it as evidence of systemic racism in his video. However, he does show clips of people like Max Kendi as examples, someone who's even further to the left than Nicole Hannah-Jones. Additionally, it should be noted that Nicole Hannah-Jones is not some fringe lefty blogger. She is one of the most well-regarded writers at the New York Times, and her article spearheaded the way that left, currently, talks about racism today as systemic. Yet, it's filled to the brim with atrocious historical inaccuracies. Just like
The higher time it takes society on average to produce something, the more valuable it becomes, as it's harder to obtain in a given quantity. If, however, technological advancement halves the time taken to produce a commodity, its exchange value likewise drops, as it's much easier to obtain the same amount of commodities than before.
Oh, and Marxists love to play with that specific definition of the labor theory of value. Socially necessary labor time. And they use this circular reasoning that is just so mind-numbingly stupid. Think back to the weight theory of value. Let's say I said all value is derived from the pounds of a commodity, or the grams of a commodity. You might say, well, the gram of gold is worth more than a pound of rice. Well, in response, I would snarkily remark, well, it's socially necessary grams, not all grams, just socially necessary ones. And you can see how ridiculous that is. And Marxists do that all the time when you mention that certain types of labor, for example, the labor of a doctor, is worth more than the labor of, say, a construction worker. Or that certain types of labor could reduce the value of a commodity. If I punch your computer and break it, well, that labor is obviously worth a lot less than if I just didn't do anything. And they constantly do this. They say, no.
Supply and demand are often considered the be-all end-all by a lot of people in regards to how price works. When there's a higher demand than there is supply, competition among buyers is higher than it is among sellers, and prices rise. Likewise, in the opposite case, when supply is greater than demand, competition among sellers causes the prices of commodities to fall. But now the question is raised, what is a rise and what is a fall in price? What even is a high or a low price? Imagine a business. This business produces commodities and sells them on a market one day for a profit of £110 per item. The next day, they return a profit of £130, and the next after that, a profit of £200. With this information alone, how can we say what a large or small profit is? Well, suppose now that we know that each commodity costs £100 to produce. The first profit is now modest. the second large, and the last astronomical. Thus, it becomes clear that it's the cost of production that provides the set point by which relative magnitudes of profit can be based. As this cost of production is a fixed value, it serves as the solution to our problem of relativity in supply and demand by acting as the point of equilibrium, the point by which supply and demand fluctuate around.
Wow. Wow. Where do I even begin? Literally every single thing that he just said was wrong. In his example, let's say this widget factory, he's sold at $160 compared to $100 cost of production. He calls this a relatively high rate of profit, as it's a rate of profit 160%. However, let's change this analogy. Say it sells at a profit rate of 160%, however, every single one of its neighboring widget factories sells at $200 with the exact same cost of production. This would actually be a relatively small rate of profit, 160%. Because even though, compared to the price of production, it's higher, it doesn't really matter. The profit rate doesn't really matter there. It's not based on production costs, but instead how the industry compares to its neighbors. Also, profit rates are not really that important to business, at least compared to other metrics of profit. For example, many companies, like furniture stores like IKEA and lawn and garden stores like Home Depot, run on very small profit rates compared to other industries, yet they do very, very well. And companies that mass produce paper or things like pizza boxes usually operate on profit margins from 1 to 2% on each commodity, yet they make it very, very well because of how many are produced. The profit rate of a business is not really that important. What's far more important is based on whether or not the business is just profitable. And whether or not a business is profitable has nothing to do. Also, the idea that the cost of production is what represents equilibrium of a supply and demand curve is batshit insane. I have no fucking clue what he's talking about. Firstly, supply and demand has nothing to do with profit rates. Profit rates have nothing to do with demand of a product, and profit rates have nothing to do with the supply of a product. The demand of a product has nothing to do with the price of production, nor does the supply, really. At least not directly. And the equilibrium point of a supply and demand graph has to do where the profit incentive of the producer and the value incentive of the consumer intersect to determine the price. There isn't a single fucking model of supply and demand anywhere that includes anywhere in it prices of production, much less profit rates. Where he gets this, I have no fucking clue. Supply and demand simply represents the value of a product for the consumer or how much there is of the commodity. And those two things intersect, and that is what determines the price. Nothing to do with prices of production. Also, this idea that prices are determined by prices of production. This is called the cost theory of value. It's extremely fallacious, and it's been disproven 200 years ago. Because, well, as I shown earlier, prices are determined by the value that it has to consumers. Period. That's all it has. That's all it is. I also really, really hate how he talks about the lack of relativity in supply and demand models as a problem needed to be solving. The fact of the matter is that the equilibrium of the supply and demand curve constantly shifts depending on what consumers want and how much there is of it. It constantly shifts. It doesn't need a set point. It doesn't need a point to which all quote-unquote fluctuations show. It doesn't need one. It's simply, that's not how economics works. All things in the economy, all values are subjective. There is no set point which everything else needs to be based.
Acting as the point of equilibrium, the point by which supply and demand fluctuate around. This equilibrium point is the exchange value of the commodity. So the market price is the exchange value represented in money with also any fluctuations from the equilibrium point included. However, this distortion from the exchange value does not only come from supply and demand, but also from things like marketing, branding, culture, etc., all of which too provide meaningless alterations on price without any kind of set point.
Three Arrows, as previously mentioned, frames his arguments as storylines, so it can be a little hard to respond to them. However, he made several points here, so let's look into them. His first point he brings up is that the law and order rhetoric was racist, and that Nixon tried to play in the public's subconscious racial biases, or more commonly known as implicit bias, in order to win the election. Now, despite the fact that there has not been a single academic study to demonstrate the validity of implicit racism, let's directly look at Three Arrows' argument. Firstly, Nixon ran dozens upon dozens of campaign ads, and Three Arrows cherry picks the ad that best suits the narrative he is trying to tell. Additionally, even if you actually look at the one advertisement he does show, it's obvious Nixon was not solely painting African Americans as dangerous, but the general 1970s scene movement as dangerous. The hippie movement, the anti-war movement, the drug movement, and yes, some African Americans as dangerous. Now, the problem of crime in the 1970s was not only a problem of the African American community, but also a problem of the hippies, the draft dodgers, and the anti-war protesters. Something that is explicitly clear in the ad that Three Arrows shows, as one of the close-ups that are shown very, very dangerously is a white person, very obviously a white person. However, fair seems superficial. So, let's look at another one of Nixon's advertisements to see if this holds up. Clearly, this doesn't paint the picture that Three Arrows claims it does. However, Three Arrows, other than that, he states that 81.
Well, it's from the law of value that Marx was able to make predictions about the development of the capitalist economy as a whole. While we can't explain each one in detail here, we can briefly outline the ones that are key and how we might see them in the world we live in. Marx bases almost all of his predictions around the commodity having an internal conflict between its intrinsic exchange value and its use value. In simple terms, this refers to the fact that what might be profitable for producers is not always useful for consumers. The most obvious examples of this might be something like the housing crisis, having more empty homes than we have homeless people, or perhaps world hunger with a large overabundance of food produced.
Wow, so there is a lot to unpack here. Firstly, the idea that there exist goods which are sold that consumers don't want but buy from producers is simply ridiculous. The idea that producers can get wealthy off of selling products to consumers that consumers don't want denies basic common sense and, I hate to use this word because it's been memed, but basic economics. The only reason economic transactions ever take place is due to the fact that consumers buy goods at a price lower than they value them. But let's look at some of the examples that he brings up. The idea that there are more houses than homeless people is simply a leftist myth. The fact of the matter is that the vast majority of homeless people live in places like San Francisco, places like New York, San Diego, places like Chicago, while the vast majority of empty houses are located in places like Nebraska, located in places like Colorado, in North and South Dakota. The idea that there are just blocks upon blocks of empty houses and empty apartments whose unkept lawns homeless people are forced to sleep on is just simply not true. In other words, these empty houses are simply nowhere near where the homeless live. Furthermore, half of the vacancies that are within these very urban places like San Diego, like New York, are not greedy capitalists hoarding land. They're due to market vacancies. Market vacancy is the inevitable gap in tenancy that occurs when a lease is ended and a home goes on the market to be resold, or a new building opens and hasn't yet leased or sold all its units. Unless you think that it's possible for a new house to be 100% sold the day that it's built, and that each tenant that moves out is instantly replaced by one who moves in, these vacancies are to be expected. And this makes sense. If you were a landlord, why would you actively choose to leave your properties vacant if you could simply rent it out at a lower price to someone else? In fact, Blackstone, a massive private equity firm, admitted in their annual reports that high vacancy rates reduce their profit shares. And even if it was true, it simply doesn't disprove the idea that producers can only get profit by selling goods to consumers that consumers want. This is seen in his food spiel. Now, a huge amount of the food that is wasted each year is by consumers throwing away food that they didn't eat. For example, if you bought too much milk and you couldn't drink it all before it went bad. And also by restaurants throwing away food that consumers left, or ingredients not enough people ordered. Now, there is no doubt that if you buy food that you won't eat, that's pretty cringe. But the fact of the matter is that consumers that buy or order excess food, even when they don't eat it, do so because they believe, quite irrationally, that it significantly raises their satisfaction levels. Also, a lot of the food wasted comes from food producers like supermarkets, who throw away pears that are bent, or bananas that are heavily bruised, or apples that have been on the shelf too long, or milk that passed its sell-by date. Though they taste the same and are safe to eat, consumers simply refuse to buy them, as consumers determine, quite irrationally, that the use values of these foods are far lower. Now, this doesn't prove the idea that producers can become wealthy by selling things that consumers don't want. It simply proves that there is a cultural problem, a very bad cultural problem, in how consumers determine what they want, and how consumers determine use values. That is the problem here. And no, this is not some capitalist conspiracy to get more profit. Think about it. Why would food producers knowingly produce more food than consumers will buy, knowingly lose money in the process? Why? There's simply no reason. In fact, one of the biggest reasons why supermarkets don't simply give away their leftover food or sell it at a reduced price to the poor is largely because of government regulation. The government has made it so that if a consumer voluntarily buys foodstuff from a producer, knowing the risks involved, and gets sick from it, the consumer becomes eligible to sue the producer. Corporations would be happy to mark down their bruised bananas and milk past its sell-by date to hungry people. However, because of government regulation, they are forced to take overly precautious measures in avoiding that. Here's the really sad thing. If corporations did sell these products at a reduced price, that would have been thrown away otherwise, to the homeless or to the poor, commies around the world will still be bitching and moaning. OMG, capitalism has literally created an underclass of people who are forced to eat rotten food to survive. Oh my god, the bourgeoisie get to feast while the poor get the scraps. You simply can't win with these people. For Marxists, it's a lose-lose situation. In summary, the labor theory of value is shit, and everyone who pushes it is shit. Even many Marxists are acknowledging this and are calling on Marxists to abandon the labor theory of value in favor of other methods. If you're still, however, desperately clinging on to this theory as actually valid and actually useful, I encourage you to at least reconsider your position. Oh, and please, of course, like and subscribe.